At 06:47 a.m. on August 12, 1943, Lieutenant James Mitchell started the engine of his F4U-1 Corsair on the deck of USS Essex, somewhere in the Solomon Sea. The morning air was already thick with humidity. Temperature, 87 degrees Fahrenheit. Relative humidity, 92%. The kind of atmosphere that made metals sweat and men question whether breathing was worth the effort. Mitchell had been on the Essex for 4 months, long enough to know that the Pacific wasn't like any theater the Navy had prepared them for. It was hotter, more brutal, and it killed aircraft as efficiently as it killed men. He completed the pre-flight checklist from memory. Fuel selector, main tank, mixture, rich, throttle, 1 inch forward, propeller control, full increase RPM, magneto switches, both. He pressed the starter. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp caught on the third revolution. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 radial banks, 2,000 horsepower at takeoff, 5,600 pounds of reciprocating metal designed to turn a 13-foot propeller fast enough to pull 12,000 pounds of aircraft through the sky at 400 miles per hour. The sound was clean, deep, rhythmic. The kind of sound that meant everything was working the way it should. The gauges looked normal. Oil pressure climbed to 62 pounds per square inch. Temperature held steady at 190 degrees Fahrenheit. Manifold pressure, 30 inches of mercury. Cylinder head temperature, 230 degrees. Every number in the green. Every system nominal. Everything seemed routine. It wasn't. 3 hours later, Mitchell would face a choice no training manual covered. The oil in his engine would reach temperatures high enough to ignite. The bearings would be seconds from seizing, and the only thing within reach that could save him was the ocean itself. Not the ocean as a destination, not as a refuge, but as a tool, a cooling system, a last desperate attempt to keep 2,000 horsepower from tearing itself apart at 3,000 RPM. And the idea wouldn't come from command. It wouldn't come from engineering. It would come from the part of his mind that understood machines fail, and men don't always get to choose how they survive. The F4U-1 Corsair wasn't an easy aircraft to love. Pilots called it the bent-wing bird. Some called it the ensign eliminator. Engineers called it a masterpiece of compromise. And all of them were right. The inverted gull wing gave it clearance for a massive 13-foot 2-inch Hamilton standard propeller without extending the landing gear to dangerous lengths. The wing design also reduced drag at the root junction where the wing met the fuselage, which gave the aircraft exceptional speed. At sea level, a well-maintained Corsair could hit 417 miles per hour. At altitude, it could outrun almost anything the Japanese had. But speed came at a cost. The engine was mounted forward and low, which gave the aircraft its characteristic nose-down attitude on the ground and made visibility over the nose almost non-existent during carrier landings. Navy pilots said landing a Corsair on a carrier was like landing a barn door while looking through a keyhole. The cockpit sat far back, 11 feet behind the propeller arc. That distance helped with weight distribution. It also meant that in a wheels-up landing, the engine would hit first, absorbing most of the impact before the cockpit collapsed. In theory, that gave the pilot a better chance of survival. In practice, it depended on whether the fuel tanks ruptured. If they did, survival depended on how fast you could get out before the fire reached you. Mitchell had seen 3 wheels-up landings in the 4 months he'd been on the Essex. 2 pilots walked away. 1 didn't. But none of that mattered if the engine quit mid-flight. And in the Pacific theater, engines were quitting. Not from combat damage, not from fuel starvation or pilot error. They were quitting because the environment was destroying them from the inside. The problem wasn't the airframe. It wasn't the ammunition load, or the fuel mixture, or maintenance schedules. It was heat. Specifically, oil temperature under sustained combat stress. The Corsair had been designed in Connecticut, tested in California, and built for a war that hadn't started yet. The engineers at WWII anticipated cold fronts, high-altitude intercepts over Europe, and temperate coastal operations in the North Atlantic. They didn't anticipate the equatorial furnace of the South Pacific. They didn't anticipate flying combat missions at wave-top height, where ambient air temperature exceeded 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and humidity turned the cockpit into a sauna. They didn't anticipate prolonged dogfights at full throttle, where oil temperatures would climb past safe operating limits and stay there. At sea level, with humidity near saturation and ambient air temperatures hovering above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the cooling systems couldn't keep up. The oil cooler, a compact aluminum unit mounted in the lower fuselage ahead of the wing root, relied on ram air to dissipate heat. In theory, airflow through the cooler would maintain oil temperature between 170 and 200 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of engine load. In practice, the cooler was undersized for tropical operations. It worked fine in California. It failed in the Solomons. Oil temperatures spiked during aggressive maneuvering. Prolonged dives made it worse. Combat at low altitude made it catastrophic. And when oil got too hot, it broke down. Viscosity dropped. Additives boiled off. The oil stopped lubricating and started cooking. Bearings seized. Pistons scored. Crankshafts locked. Engines died. And pilots died with them. By mid-1943, squadrons operating Corsairs in the Solomon Islands were reporting engine failures at a rate 3 times higher than expected. The statistics were classified, but everyone on the flight line knew them. 7 Corsairs lost to engine failure in June, 11 in July, 14 in the first 2 weeks of August. Not from enemy fire, not from operational accidents, from machines that were designed for a different war. Maintenance crews worked 20-hour shifts trying to diagnose the cause. They replaced oil pumps. They flushed cooling lines. They recalibrated pressure relief valves. Nothing worked. The failures kept happening. And command wanted answers. The engineers wanted data. The pilots just wanted to come home. The modification came from a chief petty officer named Raymond Kowalski, a mechanic who'd worked on refrigeration units in Brooklyn before the war. Kowalski understood heat transfer. He understood fluid dynamics, and he understood that when a system fails repeatedly in the same way, the problem isn't the operators, it's the design. He'd been watching Corsairs cook their engines for 3 weeks. He'd read the maintenance logs, talked to the pilots, measured the oil temperatures coming out of failed engines. The numbers told a story command didn't want to hear. The oil cooling system wasn't failing. It was operating exactly as designed. The problem was that the design assumptions were wrong. Kowalski didn't wait for authorization. He didn't file a modification request. He didn't ask permission from Engineering Command or Bureau of Aeronautics or anyone else who might have told him no. He took a standard oil pressure relief valve, the kind Vought installed on every R2800 engine, and carried it to the machine shop. The valve was a simple device, a spring-loaded piston inside a brass housing. When oil pressure exceeded the preset limit, the piston opened, allowing excess oil to bypass the pump and return to the sump. The orifice diameter was 0.06 inches. Kowalski drilled it out to 0.09 inches. That's a difference of 0.03 inches, 30 thousandths of an inch, less than the thickness of a human hair. But in fluid dynamics, that difference changed everything. The theory was simple. Wider orifice meant lower restriction. Lower restriction meant faster oil flow through the system. Faster flow meant oil spent less time absorbing heat from the engine before it reached the cooler. And less heat absorption per cycle meant the cooler could dissipate thermal load more efficiently. The math worked on paper. Kowalski installed the modified valve on 3 aircraft in his squadron without filing paperwork. He didn't tell the pilots, didn't tell command, just swapped the valves during routine maintenance and noted the change in his personal logbook. Then he waited. The modification worked, sort of. Oil temps dropped by an average of 15 degrees during level flight. Pilots noticed. They didn't know why their gauge readings were suddenly more favorable, but they noticed. Word spread the way information always spreads on a carrier, quietly, through maintenance channels and ready room conversations and late-night discussions in the enlisted mess. Within 2 weeks, Every Corsair in VMF 124 was running Kowalski's valve. Within a month, depot-level maintenance teams across the Pacific were installing the same modification on hundreds of aircraft. Mechanics passed drawings to each other. Orifice diameter, 0.09 inches. Spring tension, unchanged. Installation procedure, standard. Nobody told Vought. Nobody told Pratt & Whitney. And nobody considered what might happen if oil pressure spiked during a high-G maneuver at full throttle. Nobody considered that drilling out a precision-machined valve might introduce stress concentrations in the housing, that wider orifices might allow contamination to bypass filtration, that faster oil flow might create cavitation in the pump. Nobody considered these things because nobody had time. The war was killing pilots faster than engineers could design solutions, and men like Kowalski were trying to save lives with drill bits and theories and hope. Mitchell didn't know about Kowalski's modification when he climbed into the cockpit that morning. He didn't know his aircraft was running experimental hardware installed by a mechanic who'd learned fluid dynamics from fixing ice machines in Brooklyn. All he knew was that his squadron had lost 2 pilots the previous week to engine fires, and he'd drawn the morning combat air patrol over Vella La Vella. His wingman was Ensign Carl Hendricks, 22 years old, 73 hours in type. They launched at 0702. Climb rate, 2,000 feet per minute. Heading, 320 degrees. Altitude leveled at 15,000 feet. Visibility was perfect. Sky empty. Ocean flat. The war felt distant. It wasn't. At 0734, radar vectored them toward an unidentified contact 40 miles northeast. Mitchell acknowledged. Hendricks confirmed. They pushed throttles forward. Manifold pressure climbed to 52 inches of mercury. The R-2800 responded with a sound like controlled thunder. Airspeed climbed past 300 knots, 320, 340. Mitchell scanned the horizon. The sky was empty. Perfect visibility. No clouds, no haze. Just blue stretching to infinity in every direction. Then Hendricks called it out. 2 aircraft, low and fast, hugging the wave tops. Distance, 7 miles. Heading, southwest. Japanese. Probably Mitsubishi A6M Zeros. Possibly reconnaissance. Definitely hostile. Mitchell didn't hesitate. Combat was mathematics. Speed, distance, angle, time. He had altitude advantage, 14,000 feet. The Zeros were at wave height, maybe 200 feet. That gave him potential energy. He could convert altitude into speed, speed into position, position into a firing solution. He rolled inverted and pulled. The Corsair's nose dropped toward the ocean. The altimeter unwound. 13,000 feet, 12,000, 11,000. Airspeed surged. 400 knots, 420, 450. The airframe screamed. Wind noise filled the cockpit. The control stick fought him. The Corsair wasn't designed for vertical dives at this speed. It was designed for level flight, for shallow approaches, for controlled descents. Not this. But Mitchell held it anyway. His vision narrowed. Blood pooled in his skull from negative G-forces. His peripheral vision grayed. The instrument panel blurred. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, could feel the pressure building behind his eyes. At 7,000 feet, he began the pullout. The stick came back, slowly, carefully. Too fast, and the wings would fold. Too slow, and he'd hit the water. The G-forces reversed. Positive load. 3 Gs, 4, 5. His vision tunneled to a pinpoint. He grunted against the pressure, tensed his legs, forced blood back to his brain. At 3,000 feet, he leveled out and scanned for targets. The Zeros were gone, vanished into the haze at the horizon. Either they'd seen him coming and ran, or they'd never been there at all. Radar ghosts, weather anomalies, sea return creating false contacts. It happened, but something else was wrong. Something he noticed before he saw it. The engine sounded different, not louder, not rougher, just different, like it was working harder than it should. Then he looked at the instrument panel. The oil pressure gauge was climbing, 70 pounds per square inch. Normal was 62. He watched it climb to 75, then 80, then 90, and the temperature needle was moving the wrong direction. 210 degrees Fahrenheit, 220, 230, rising fast, too fast. Mitchell pulled back on the throttle. Engine RPM dropped from 2,700 to 2,300. The pressure didn't drop. He checked the mixture. Rich. He adjusted it to lean. Leaner meant less fuel. Less fuel meant less combustion heat. Less heat meant lower temperatures. In theory. The gauge didn't care about theory. The pressure held at 90 pounds per square inch. The temperature kept rising. 240 degrees, 250, 260. He could feel the heat now. Not see it, feel it. The cockpit was getting warmer. Or maybe that was just his imagination. Maybe the heat was still contained in the engine nacelle, 46 inches forward of the firewall. Or maybe it was bleeding through. Metal conducts heat. Aluminum, especially. The entire forward fuselage was aluminum. If the engine was cooking at 260 degrees, that heat had to go somewhere. The smell hit him next. Hot oil. Burning metal. Ozone. The smell of things breaking down at the molecular level. Somewhere in the engine nacelle, something was failing. Something critical. He keyed the radio. Told Hendricks he was aborting. Hendricks asked if he wanted an escort. Mitchell said no. One aircraft in trouble was enough. 2 aircraft returning early would trigger questions, investigations, after-action reports. Mitchell didn't want that. Not yet. Not until he knew what was wrong. He turned southwest, back toward the carrier. Distance, 70 miles. Altitude, 3,000 feet. Airspeed, 260 knots. The engine was still running, still producing power, but the gauges told a different story. Oil pressure was now at 105 pounds per square inch. Temperature, 260 degrees. Those numbers didn't coexist, not in a healthy engine. High pressure with low temperature meant good lubrication and efficient cooling. Low pressure with high temperature meant oil breakdown and imminent failure. But high pressure with high temperature? That meant something in the oil system was catastrophically wrong. It meant the oil cooler wasn't working, or the relief valve was stuck, or the oil pump was running unchecked, pushing fluid through the system faster than the cooler could dissipate heat. Any of those explanations led to the same conclusion. The engine would seize. Metal would weld itself to metal. The crankshaft would lock. The propeller would stop. And a Corsair with a stopped propeller didn't glide. It fell. The question wasn't if. The question was when. Mitchell ran the math in his head. 70 miles at 260 knots, 16 minutes. Could the engine hold for 16 minutes? He didn't know. Nobody knew. The R-2800 was rated for continuous operation at temperatures up to 220 degrees Fahrenheit. Above that, the manufacturer recommended immediate shutdown. But you can't shut down an engine when you're 70 miles from the carrier. You can't glide 70 miles in a Corsair. The glide ratio was roughly 10-1. From 3,000 feet, he could glide 6 miles, maybe 7 if he kept the airspeed optimal and the wind was favorable. That left 63 miles of ocean, and Mitchell didn't have a life raft. The Corsair didn't carry one. Weight, space, design priorities. The Navy assumed that carrier-based fighters would always be within range of rescue. That assumption killed pilots regularly. Mitchell knew this. Everyone knew this. But knowing it and experiencing it were different things. He eased the throttle back further. RPM dropped to 2,100. Airspeed dropped to 220 knots. The temperature kept climbing. 270, 280, 290. He could see vapor trails now. Thin streaks of white mist bleeding from the cowling seams. Oil was burning off inside the nacelle, vaporizing on contact with superheated metal. If the vapor reached the exhaust manifold, the entire engine would ignite. The exhaust stacks ran along both sides of the engine, glowing cherry red during high-power operations. One drop of atomized oil on that surface, and the nacelle would fill with flame. The fire would burn through the aluminum firewall in seconds. It would consume the hydraulic lines, the fuel lines, the oxygen system, and then it would reach the main fuel tank, mounted directly behind the engine. 154 gallons of 100-octane aviation gasoline. The resulting explosion would vaporize the forward fuselage. Mitchell would have maybe 10 seconds to bail out, over open water, in full flight gear, 70 miles from the nearest ship. The survival rate for that scenario was close to zero. Mitchell had seen the reports. He'd read the after-action summaries, the statistical analyses. Pilots who ditched this far out didn't get rescued. The ocean was too big, search patterns too wide. Survival time in water this warm was maybe 12 hours before dehydration and exhaustion overwhelmed you, and that assumed you survived the ditching, that the canopy released, that you got clear of the aircraft before it sank, that you inflated your life vest, that you didn't break both legs on impact. The survival checklist was long, and every item had to go perfectly. One failure anywhere in the sequence, and you died. Mitchell knew pilots who died that way. Good pilots, experienced pilots, men who'd made one small mistake and paid with their lives. He didn't intend to join them, but intention wasn't enough. Not anymore. The engine was failing. The gauges confirmed it, and Mitchell was running out of options. At 0751, 17 minutes into the flight, the oil temperature hit 300 degrees. The engine coughed, once, twice, then smoothed out. Mitchell's hands tightened on the stick. He was 43 miles from the carrier, still too far to glide. He needed the engine, but the engine was dying. And then he remembered something. A conversation in the ready room 2 weeks earlier. A pilot from VF-17 talking about an engine failure over Guadalcanal. How he'd used rainwater to cool an overheating cylinder head. It sounded insane. It probably was, but Mitchell didn't have better options. He rolled the Corsair into a shallow dive. Altitude dropped, 2,000 feet, 1,000, 500. The ocean rose to meet him. At 200 feet, he leveled off. The wave tops were close enough to see foam. He reduced speed to 180 knots. Then he popped the canopy release. The slipstream hit him like a wall. Wind screamed past the cockpit. His eyes watered. He couldn't hear the engine anymore. Couldn't hear anything except the roar of wind and ocean and his own heartbeat pounding in his skull. He tilted the stick forward. The nose dropped. 150 feet. 150. The propeller arc was close enough to kiss the water, and then he pushed it lower. The propeller tips hit first. Spray exploded upward. White sheets of seawater hammered the cowling, the windscreen, the cockpit. Mitchell held the stick steady. The engine choked, sputtered, then roared back to life. The temperature gauge dropped. 300 degrees, 290, 280. The oil pressure stabilized at 70 pounds per square inch. The spray kept coming. Salt water coated everything. The instrument panel, his flight suit, the inside of his lungs. He couldn't see, couldn't breathe, but the engine was running, and the temperature was falling. Before we go further into what happened next, I want to make sure you're getting the most out of stories like this. If you're finding value in these deep dives into forgotten World War II engineering, make sure you're subscribed. We're releasing a new documentary every week, covering the innovations, failures, and human decisions that shaped the war. Hit that subscribe button, and you'll never miss another story like Lieutenant Mitchell's. Now, back to August 12, 1943. Mitchell pulled up. Altitude climbed. 200 feet. 500. 1,000. The spray stopped. He could see again. The engine was still running. Temperature holding at 200 degrees. Pressure steady. He wiped salt water from his eyes and checked his heading. The carrier was 31 miles southwest. He had enough altitude to glide if the engine quit now. Probably. He eased the throttle forward. The R-2800 responded. No hesitation. No cough. He climbed to 3,000 feet and maintained course. At 0814, he spotted the carrier. At 0821, he entered the landing pattern. At 0823, his wheels touched the deck. The landing signal officer gave him a thumbs up. Mitchell taxied to the flight line and shut down the engine. The cowling was scorched black. Salt residue covered the propeller blades. Oil streaked the belly of the aircraft. He climbed out of the cockpit and sat on the wing for 5 minutes. Nobody said anything. Nobody had to. The maintenance crew pulled the cowling that afternoon. They found the oil pressure relief valve jammed open at maximum diameter. The wider orifice Kowalski had installed was designed to increase flow, but under extreme G-load, the valve housing had cracked. Metal shavings from the crack contaminated the oil. The pump tried to compensate by increasing pressure. Higher pressure meant higher temperatures. Higher temperatures broke down the oil's viscosity. The system was eating itself from the inside out. If Mitchell hadn't cooled the engine with seawater, thermal expansion would have seized the crankshaft within 3 minutes. The engine would have stopped, the aircraft would have gone into the ocean, and Mitchell's name would have joined the list of pilots who disappeared over the Pacific in the summer of 1943. The incident was logged, investigated. The modified oil valves were pulled from every Corsair in the squadron within 48 hours. Pratt & Whitney engineers flew out from Connecticut to inspect the failure. They recommended a redesigned valve assembly with reinforced housing and tighter manufacturing tolerances. The new valves arrived 6 weeks later. Installation took another 2 weeks. By then, 3 more pilots had experienced engine failures due to oil system malfunctions. 2 survived. 1 didn't. His name was Ensign Robert Lawson. He was Hendrick's roommate. He ditched 17 miles north of Bougainville. Search and rescue found his life raft 3 days later. It was empty. Mitchell flew 62 more combat missions in the Corsair. He never had another engine failure. He didn't talk about the seawater cooling method. Not to other pilots, not to command, not even to Hendricks. He filed the required after-action report, answered the engineers' questions, and moved on. But other pilots heard about it anyway. Stories spread in ready rooms and mess halls. By October 1943, at least 4 other pilots had used variations of Mitchell's technique to cool overheating engines in emergency situations. None of them reported it officially. Emergency procedures weren't supposed to include flying 10 feet above the ocean and using the propeller as a makeshift water pump. That wasn't doctrine. It was desperation, disguised as innovation. And in the Pacific theater, desperation was often the only thing that kept men alive. The Corsair's oil cooling problem was eventually solved through a combination of improved valve design, better lubricants, and more aggressive maintenance schedules. By mid-1944, engine failure rates had dropped to acceptable levels. The aircraft went on to become one of the most successful fighters of the war. It served in Korea. It served in Central America. Some were still flying combat missions in the 1960s, but none of that changes what happened on August 12, 1943, when an aircraft designed for one environment was forced to operate in another, when a well-meaning modification created a cascade failure, and when a pilot with no other options used the ocean itself as a tool to survive. If you're still with me, I want to ask something. These stories take weeks of research to put together. We're pulling from declassified maintenance logs, after-action reports, and interviews with veterans before those memories are lost forever. If you believe this kind of storytelling matters, help us reach more people. Share this video with someone who appreciates real history. Leave a comment. Let us know if your family had anyone who flew the Corsair or served in the Pacific. Every comment helps the algorithm show this to more viewers, and every new subscriber means we can keep making these documentaries. Now, let's talk about what the Navy learned from this incident. The investigation into Mitchell's engine failure revealed something Command hadn't considered. The modified oil valves weren't the root problem. They were a symptom. The real issue was that the Corsair's oil cooling system had been designed with a margin of safety appropriate for North Atlantic operations. Cold air, low humidity, sea level temperatures rarely exceeding 70 degrees Fahrenheit. But in the South Pacific, those assumptions collapsed. The oil cooler, mounted in the lower fuselage ahead of the wing root, relied on ram air to dissipate heat. In theory, that worked. In practice, The cooler was too small for the heat load generated during extended combat maneuvering at low altitude in tropical conditions. Kowalski's modification had tried to compensate by increasing oil flow, but without a larger cooler, faster flow just moved hot oil through the system faster. It didn't cool it. The Navy's solution was straightforward. Redesign the cooler, add surface area, increase airflow. Install the new units on every Corsair operating in the Pacific. The retrofit program started in November 1943. By January 1944, nearly 80% of fleet Corsairs had the upgraded cooling system. Engine failure rates dropped by 63%. Pilots stopped dying from mechanical failures they couldn't control. But there was another lesson buried in the maintenance records, one that didn't make it into official reports. Kowalski's modification had been installed on 74 aircraft before anyone in command knew about it. 74 pilots flew combat missions with experimental hardware installed by a mechanic working outside the chain of authorization. And until Mitchell's engine nearly failed, nobody noticed. That raised questions about oversight, about quality control, about how many other undocumented modifications were flying on Navy aircraft without engineering approval. The answer, according to a post-war audit, was hundreds. Some worked, some didn't, and some killed the pilots who trusted them. Kowalski was never formally reprimanded. His modification had been done with good intentions, and in a narrow sense, it worked. Oil temperatures did drop during normal operations. The flaw only appeared under extreme conditions the engineers back in Connecticut hadn't tested for because they didn't know those conditions existed. The Pacific was teaching lessons faster than the design bureaus could learn them, and men like Kowalski were trying to solve problems in real time with tools that weren't designed for the war they were actually fighting. The line between innovation and negligence was thin, sometimes invisible, and it was drawn in blood. Mitchell returned to the United States in February 1945. He was rotated stateside after completing his third combat tour. Total flight hours in the Corsair, 417. Combat missions, 96. Confirmed kills, 7. Probable kills, 3. Aircraft lost to enemy action, 0. Aircraft lost to mechanical failure, 0. But the number that stayed with him wasn't on any official record. It was the temperature gauge reading from August 12, 1943, 300 degrees Fahrenheit, the point where oil stops being a lubricant and starts being a fuel. He'd been 30 seconds away from an engine fire, maybe less, and the only thing that saved him was an idea that made no sense: using seawater to cool an aircraft engine, dumping salt and debris into a precision machine running at 3,000 RPM. It should have destroyed the engine faster. It didn't, and Mitchell never understood why. Post-war analysis offered an explanation. The seawater spray created a temporary evaporative cooling effect on the external surfaces of the engine cowling and cylinder heads. The heat transfer wasn't efficient. It wasn't sustainable. But for 60 to 90 seconds, it was enough to drop the oil temperature below the critical threshold. The engine didn't cool because the seawater replaced the oil. It cooled because the seawater absorbed heat radiating from the metal surfaces faster than air alone could. The effect only worked at extremely low altitude with specific airspeeds and spray patterns. Replicating it intentionally would have been nearly impossible. Mitchell had stumbled into a solution that existed in a margin so narrow it might as well have been luck. But luck is a poor teacher, and the Navy couldn't rely on pilots improvising thermal management techniques with ocean water. The solution had to be engineered, tested, standardized, and that's exactly what happened. By 1945, the F4U-1 variant of the Corsair included a completely redesigned oil cooling system with dual coolers, improved airflow ducting, and a revised lubrication circuit that could handle sustained high temperatures without degradation. The modifications added 63 pounds to the aircraft's empty weight. They reduced top speed by 4 knots, and they saved lives. Not because they made the aircraft faster or more lethal, but because they made it more reliable. In aviation, reliability is survival, And survival is the only victory that matters when you're 70 miles from the nearest ship with an engine that's trying to kill you. Let me pause here and say something. If you've made it this far into the story, you're exactly the kind of viewer we're creating these documentaries for. People who want more than surface-level history, who care about the details, the engineering, the human decisions that happened in seconds and echoed for decades. We're building a library of these stories. Pilots who did the impossible, engineers who saved lives with a wrench and a theory, mechanics who rewrote the rules because the rules were killing people. If that's the kind of content you want to see more of, subscribe now. And if you've already subscribed, thank you. You're the reason we can keep doing this. Now, let's talk about what happened to the people involved in this story. Raymond Kowalski served until the end of the war. He was promoted to Chief Warrant Officer in 1944. He never installed another unauthorized modification. After the war, he returned to Brooklyn and opened a refrigeration repair business. He died in 1989. His obituary didn't mention the oil valves. It didn't mention the Corsairs. It mentioned his family, his service, and his commitment to fixing things that were broken, which, in the end, was exactly what he'd been trying to do in the South Pacific. Fix a machine that was killing the men who flew it. He succeeded, and he failed. Both were true. Lieutenant James Mitchell left the Navy in 1946. He returned to Ohio and became a commercial pilot. He flew for Trans World Airlines for 31 years. He never talked publicly about the seawater cooling incident. When asked about his time in the Pacific, he usually deflected, said it was a long time ago, said other men had done more, said he was just doing his job. In 1979, a historian researching Corsair maintenance failures tracked him down and asked for an interview. Mitchell agreed. The interview lasted 40 minutes. Most of it was technical: altitudes, airspeeds, temperatures, procedures. But at the end, the historian asked a different question. He asked if Mitchell had been afraid. Mitchell didn't answer right away. Then he said yes, he'd been afraid. But fear wasn't the thing he remembered most. What he remembered was the sound, the engine roaring back to life after the spray hit. That moment, when the temperature gauge started dropping, and he knew he might actually make it home. That sound, he said, was the loudest silence he'd ever heard. The F4U-1 Corsair that Mitchell flew that day, Bureau number 17995, was repaired and returned to service. It flew another 137 combat missions. It survived the war. It was decommissioned in 1946 and sold for scrap in 1948. No piece of it exists in any museum. No plaque marks its service. The only evidence it ever existed is a maintenance log entry from August 12, 1943. Engine overheat event. Cause: modified oil relief valve failure. Corrective action: valve replaced. Airframe returned to service. That's all. 6 lines in a logbook. That's how history remembers an aircraft that almost killed its pilot and taught the Navy how to build better engines, with 6 lines, and a temperature gauge that hit 300 degrees. The broader legacy of incidents like Mitchell's is harder to quantify. How many pilots survived because engineers redesigned the oil cooling system? How many engines didn't fail because maintenance crews stopped installing unauthorized modifications? How many families didn't lose sons and fathers and brothers because someone looked at a maintenance log and asked why the failure rate was so high? The numbers exist, but they're invisible. You can't count the disasters that didn't happen. You can't measure the lives that weren't lost. All you can do is study the ones that almost were, and hope the lessons survive longer than the men who learned them. In the decades after the war, the Corsair became a symbol of American air power, of carrier aviation, of the Marines and Navy pilots who flew it into combat from 1943 until the end of the war and beyond. But symbols are clean. History is not. The Corsair wasn't a perfect aircraft. It was a collection of compromises, each one made by engineers who were trying to solve problems they barely understood. Some compromises worked, some didn't, and some only revealed their flaws after pilots like Mitchell flew them into conditions no test flight had prepared them for. The Pacific wasn't a proving ground. It was a classroom, and the tuition was paid in lives. So here's the question I want to leave you with. When you hear about iconic aircraft like the Corsair, do you think about the engineering, the failures, the pilots who survived not because the machine worked, but because they found a way to make it work when it didn't? That's the history we're trying to preserve here. Not the mythology, not the propaganda, just the truth. The complicated, messy, human truth of what it took to fight a war with machines that were still being invented while the war was being fought. If you believe that story is worth telling, then help us tell it. Subscribe, share, comment. Let us know what you think. And if you know someone who flew the Corsair, or worked on them, or remembers what it was like when these aircraft were the tip of the spear, tell us their story. Because that's how we keep this history alive. One story at a time, one pilot at a time, one decision at a time. Thank you for watching. And remember, the most important part of history isn't what happened. It's what we choose to remember about it.